Well, the day has come for my Sonic fan card to be revoked. After 6 playthroughs of various types, desperately searching for enlightenment along the way, I've come to the conclusion that I don't see how I can ever truly like Sonic CD. For every decision I feel was creative or well implemented, I find several that completely contradict the core of the game. I can sum up Sonic CD's entire design philosophy in one sentence. Sonic CD is a game about exploration, where nearly all exploration is met with active hostility in regards to the developer-player relationship. That just sort of is Sonic CD. I played this game in every way I could think of, twice where I found every robot generator and also tried unsuccessfully to get every time stone, both with the original Spin Dash and with the Sonic 2 variant. Twice where I just ran to the end of each stage like a regular Sonic game. Again, once with the original Spin Dash and once with the Sonic 2 variant. One playthrough with Tails, and one more just trying to have fun exploring each time period. I also switched between both soundtracks across both playthroughs. Through all of that, my enjoyment for the game never even reached the levels it does with Sonic 1, which I don't go back to that often for a reason. And my frustration levels were peaked fairly regularly too. Playthroughs consistently felt like they dragged on far longer than they actually did. After all of it, I just don't really get the appeal. I completely understand the infatuation with Sonic CD's design goals. In theory, a Sonic CD done well is the type of game that I'd love to play. But in practice, CD spends most of its time assaulting and poking fun at its players. That's a pretty harsh conclusion. I've got a lot of work ahead of me to try and justify it, so let's jump in. I guess we should probably start light and talk about the graphics. I don't really like a lot of what Sonic CD's aesthetic tries to pull off. I used to think it was mostly because the colors seemed to be intentionally selected to be as brash and obnoxious as possible in many stages. I've come to realize that it's not really the colors themselves that bother me though. Some of the combinations aren't exactly appealing, but that's mostly relegated to the bad future levels, so it makes sense. Others, like Tidal Tempest or Metallic Madness in the good future, legitimately look good as far as the colors are concerned. My problem is much more about how the simplistic tile set patterns used create an unflattering and migraine-inducing overabundance of said clashing colors. I think people overestimate how often super extreme checker patterns and such were used as the centerpiece of level aesthetics in the other Sonic games. Sonic 1 used this as the main aesthetic idea in a whopping one level, Green Hill Zone. You could maybe also argue Spring Yard, but I didn't even notice the tiny circles until I captured the footage just to make sure, so it's difficult for me to argue it's the level's aesthetic highlight. Anyway, Sonic 2 only had it play a minor role in some stages, and the only Sonic 3 and Knuckles level to highlight it was Mushroom Hill. These otherworldly, flat patterns are easy to remember not because they were a staple of Sonic, even though they are now, but because they were so different. They stood out both from other games and from the other levels in Sonic games. This aesthetic was very much the exception, not the rule. So when they used super vibrant, complementary colors in the other games, they actually complemented and highlighted the strengths of each other, rather than clashing. Strong colors such as this that would normally strain your eyes were used in very minor ways to bring things to life. CD overuses simple patterns to such a degree that the disparate colors highlight how banal the tile patterns actually are, and at least for me, they strain the eyes. 4 of the 7 levels use these patterns, meaning effectively 40 out of the 70 stage variants end up looking repetitive and flat, even when the colors aren't overbearing. You can see this in stages like Tidal Tempest, where the color schemes actually work well, but it still ends up looking blocky, flat, and uninspired. As a quick side note, there are also a few sprites that feel almost unfinished. I can't say I love the enemy designs as a whole. Even in HD, enemies like this guy feel pointlessly cheap, since it's extremely difficult to avoid his tiny, light gray projectiles. Other enemies, like this one though, feel like their shading and animations are missing definition. I don't know if that was a hardware limitation or a color limitation or something, and I'm not a pixel artist, but doesn't this already kinda look better? The game also overuses the strange plant life and background tile designs of the first game, and haphazardly places them wherever, often leading to nonsensical floating star plant things that look more like a bunch of stickers a small child placed randomly in paint. Signs in stages like Collision Chaos are eye-straining and equally nonsensical. Nearly every set-piece tile in this stage is just thrown wherever with no sense of design, which only serves to create a unified aesthetic in how random it all is. Look at all these symbols. Why are they blinking like this? What purpose does this serve other than to kinda just look ugly? So essentially, if the game isn't busy looking overly simple because of basic patterns, it often looks far too busy, not detailed, but busy. What's worse though is that this isn't always the case. Levels like Stardust Speedway can look really beautiful because their designs have consistency. It doesn't overly rely on patterns, and it limits how chaotic tile placement is. It lets the background do a lot of the work and uses the darker background colors to bring the bright foreground colors out. At least the stage names are excellent, arguably the best in the series. I don't necessarily think that CD is god-awful ugly as I did before giving it all these playthroughs, but I also feel it just doesn't even begin to compare to the more complex tile sets of something like Sonic 3 and Knuckles, or even the vibrant consistency of Sonic 2. It hits lower lows than Sonic 1 quite regularly, but I think the good-looking sections hit higher highs than it as well, so it's a mixed bag, I guess. Moving on, the music in CD is just fine. Some of it I really enjoy, like the Japanese Collision Chaos Good Future. Both the Japanese title Tempest Past and Present and both the US Wacky Workbench and Stardust Speedway Bad Futures. I wouldn't say any of the music is bad. I don't really favor one version of the OST over the other either. I think they're both more than fine, and honestly, they were largely the only thing that I actually wanted to go back to in each playthrough. Some arrangements stood out, while others were rather boring and blended in, but it was perfectly fine overall. So, the game then. Some people believe CD's use of vertical design and emphasis on exploration leads to a gloriously designed game. Others feel that it drops the ball entirely, simply because it provides next to none of the gameplay Sonic is traditionally known for in 2D. I am not gonna pretend I'm in the middle of this argument. I fit squarely into one category, though with a single caveat, and not for the reasons so many others sit in said category. I really don't like a lot of CD's design, the caveat being that I can see how it could have been great, and I don't think CD fails because it doesn't provide your usual 2D Sonic experience either. Sonic's basic mechanics could be used well in many circumstances. The goal should just be to find them. So the problem isn't that the game isn't Sonic enough, but really ends up being that it doesn't succeed in designing around its alternative. This game does not work as a Sonic game that's focused on exploration and verticality. It has a few standout moments, but by and large it's tedious and awkward. Sonic CD has so much content. Again, 70 levels of it across 7 zones. But it also disincentivizes exploring 50% of it. All you really care about is getting to the past to find the robot generators. The present is just a means to an end, but regardless, you need to at least explore it to find the past sign and find a way to use said sign. The good future is only worth exploring once you've destroyed the robot generator, but there's no reason to do so that's intrinsic to the game's design, and it's often difficult to destroy the robot generator and then use 2 future signs to reach it before the end of the level. The bad future has absolutely nothing for you either and can't even be reached if you've destroyed the robot generator. So anytime you're in it, you're actively harming your ability to progress. The only other useful time period is therefore the past, where your main goal is. So immediately, as soon as you understand what your goal is in the game, 50% of the stages and work are just pointless. As far as the levels themselves go, they're usually mostly the same between time periods, but that also means that if one version of a zone suffers from an issue, it's likely that they all will. The boxy designs of many levels is the first issue that really began to frustrate me. Sonic doesn't do well with corners and flat planes. He functions in these environments, but they inhibit his ability to use nearly all of the mechanics that make him interesting to control. A lot of CD consists of this, just flat planes and stair-step platforms. There's a lot of low ceilings to hit as well, and really tight corridors railroading you down certain paths at points too. I really don't think playing CD as, say, Mario, for the most part, would be much different than playing as Sonic, and I would argue that's a problem, because you're not utilizing all of Sonic's mechanics to their fullest. This seems to have been done to make traveling through time an actual challenge. You see, passing by a past or future sign will only give you that respective status. You then have to reach and maintain a certain speed for a set amount of time before Sonic will actually go back to the future or whatever. Cool, right? A mechanic in a Sonic game that genuinely rewards creative use of levels to gain speed. But again, a lot of what makes up these stages is just flat ground, steps, and tight corridors. In most zones, the levels are so full of this type of design that you can't really get too creative with gaining speed. Instead, there are very clearly designated areas where you're supposed to gain speed. Many times this manifests itself as 2 springs that face each other, for you to bounce between with no real effort involved. Other times it's a suspiciously long flat corridor with little in the way of obstacles to stop you. Sometimes it's just a half pipe that doesn't seem to go anywhere. CD really pushes you with its design to only go fast when it wants you to go fast, so this mechanic where you need to gain speed in order to time travel is highly restricted. It kind of misses the point. Palm Tree Panic and Stardust Speedway allow for some freedom since they're the most open and fast stages to begin with. They still have the clear, you're supposed to go fast here areas though, so there's little point in trying to time travel elsewhere. Most of the other stages rely on these go fast here sections almost entirely, not because you can't go fast elsewhere, but because you only get one chance to time travel from each sign. Almost get there and fail? Well, you'd either better find another sign, restart, or resign yourself to that utter failure. After all, you can't get the good ending at all unless you destroy the robot generator hidden in every past stage, or get every time stone. And signs to travel to the past are usually far less common than the future signs, which are regularly placed in areas to troll players, by the way. Pass a future sign while trying to travel to the past, and you've missed that opportunity there as well, and wasted that past sign. Because of all this stuff, it's usually best once you've found a sign to either first search for the intended place to use it and then collect the sign, or collect the sign and then tiptoe around until you find where the sign should be used. You don't have enough chances to experiment, so it's really only feasible most of the time to do it the one intended way. Metallic Madness Act 1 is really the only level where I could find a clearly denoted place where you're supposed to time travel, but that's because as far as I can tell, there was literally only one place where you can even time travel without exploiting some really awkward or frame-perfect movements. Had they wanted to completely solve the time travel issue while retaining the speed requirement, all they'd have had to do was make the signs reusable, and not have past/future abilities disappear if you don't go fast enough for long enough. Let us keep it until we pass another sign. As a small side note, why can I time out after 10 minutes still in such an enormous game that's designed entirely around exploration? I only came up against this once or twice, but that's purely because as soon as I destroyed the generator, I got the heck out of Dodge. Had I wanted to explore the future or whatever, I'd have been giving up lives just to reset the timer by timing out. What's the point? Not like there's anything optional worth exploring other than rings and power-ups, which there are plenty of in every time period. The only other thing to find in any stage is the Metal Sonic hologram generators, which are also only found in the past, so incentives to explore only get more one-sided toward the past. But it only gets worse when you introduce the bafflingly poor use of some of the gimmicks. This is where it started to feel like Sonic CD was giving me the middle finger whenever I tried to explore and enjoy it. It's interesting because the chaotic design of the aesthetic feels like it bleeds into the level structure as well, thanks to these gimmicks. While Stardust Speedway looks good, it has huge problems with inconsistent track transitions, using these darker background paths that are intended to switch tracks. Because of the linear nature of the other games, there wasn't usually much of an issue with tracks overlapping inconsistently. But because CD is designed around exploration, players need to be able to move between the tracks at will. Instead of locking all of these inside small set pieces to transition safely, they're placed wherever the designers wanted, meaning it can sometimes be infuriating trying to get where you want to go, simply because Sonic won't switch tracks. Lucky for us, these intentional design quirks seem to be rather uncommon in CD. Unlucky for us, entirely intentional trolling is much more common in CD. Entire levels are often built around frustrating gimmicks, again, often with half-baked experimental placement of said gimmicks. The emphasis on bumpers in levels like Collision Chaos often do nothing more than impede progress and push players into hazards. There's little forethought in regards to giving set pieces space, with trolly bumpers often hanging out right next to otherwise fine ramps or whatever, forcing the player to be extra delicate with the controls. The punishment for not doing so ranges from annoyingly wasting several seconds as you slow Sonic down and move him back to where he needs to be being knocked far enough away that you take damage or have to trek all the way back up to where you were. These things are very, very rarely used in technical platforming challenges to aid exploration or to emphasize speed. It's almost always a trick played on players instead. This is an issue that every 2D Sonic game has, mind you. Is there anyone who finds stages filled with bumpers to be enjoyable for this reason? Because usually when you're forced to interface with bumpers, it's not a fun experience. Collision Chaos is one of these levels, where doing anything requires using or avoiding bumpers in some way. I don't think I need to spend more time explaining why this isn't very enjoyable. Also, doesn't stuff like this just look like an experimental mess that somehow made it into the final game? It looks like a Mario Maker level for Sonic, where the bottom of the stage is just lined with nothing but springs going every which way, and above you are just a ton of bumpers and bumper platforms. Just why? What purpose does this serve? What does this add to the level? How does this help me? How am I supposed to consistently traverse this without going on a set path every time? Levels like Wacky Workbench could have worked, but end up being nonsensically frustrating. Under nearly every circumstance, being up at the top of the level is a bad thing. There's rarely anything but obstacles or dead ends up there, and yet the bottom of the stage is almost nothing but a giant electrical trampoline that rockets you all the way back up to the top. It's not necessarily the punishment that's the problem, so much as that the punishment is so severe. Meanwhile, there's little in the way of a consistent way to avoid it, since modern screens are in a 16:9 aspect ratio rather than a 9:16 aspect ratio. Timing your drops so you'll land on the randomly placed, sometimes spinning, sometimes not, often trap-crossing platforms isn't really a skill one can learn. Leaps of faith where you pray you land on a platform instead of dropping to the bottom and being rocketed back to where you just came from are mandatory here. And for what reason? What is engaging about finding your way back down? It's usually just running back and forth across ledges and waiting for electricity traps. Why is any of this designed this way? Some of these are good gimmicks and they're just being wasted. Tidal Tempest has these fireball shooters that, for reasons unbeknownst to me, don't hurt you. Instead, they just push you away, carrying you along their path. It'd still be annoying, but it wouldn't be an actual problem if I could actually keep them in view when trying to pass them. Instead, it's luck whether I'll get past both the blocks and the fireballs to reach my destination. This is here to do nothing but waste my time. And then when you factor in a few cheap robot generator placements, like this infamous one in Wacky Workbench here, it starts to feel like the game just hates you. This would be a cool idea if there was any signposting. Then again, with levels that are this random in visual design, how can you even signpost effectively? CD's also got some quirks that can throw people off that simply weren't issues in Sonic 1, nor the later games. For example, in most of the other games, speed shoes only speed up the normal level music, while invincibility plays a jingle. In CD, both power-ups play a different jingle. I personally use the audio cue of the song ending to know when my invincibility is up. I'm not looking at Sonic to pay attention to that, I'm looking ahead like you're supposed to. So in CD, if I get invincibility and then shoes, I can't tell when the invincibility will end because the shoe theme overwrites the invincibility theme. There is a visual cue obviously, which is why this is a minor issue, but again, I'm not looking at Sonic, so I end up taking damage because of this more times than one would think. Wouldn't be a big deal if it wasn't a problem that had already been avoided in the previous game. A classic case of being so concerned with the coolitude of your new CD audio that the game's design suffers. To be fair, I believe this is also a potential problem in Mania, but I've never had it come up. One of the more controversial points I want to make ties back to my statements back when we first started talking about the gameplay. I personally believe that the designs of this game fail to use Sonic's mechanics well at all as a platformer. It's not that it's focused on exploration rather than speed. As I've said before, speed is a character and marketing trait for Sonic, which is usually a reward for skilled play in the series. It is not a requirement for a Sonic game to be good. But what is a requirement for the 2D titles at least is clever use of Sonic's core platforming traits. CD almost never uses these in any way. When it wants to focus on platforming and exploration, it usually uses very short, square step-like platforms and such to achieve this, rendering Sonic's core mechanics almost non-existent. Meanwhile, when it wants to emphasize speed for exploration like in Stardust Speedway, so much of it is done through forced propulsion in tunnel sections, and you really have no input in the matter. There are points where the game tries to utilize Sonic's momentum-based controls, but they almost never amount to anything. You end up with interesting things like these extremely tall half-pipes that don't really lead to anything. They're just there to be there. A Sonic game focused on exploration doesn't have to be divorced from Sonic's core control design like CD usually is. There could have been a much greater emphasis on using your speed, or things like the rebound you get from landing on enemies to reach new areas. But CD doesn't often do this, instead mostly relying on usually frustrating stage gimmicks aimed at impeding your progress, or nothing outside of Sonic's basic jump command. It basically creates exploration by looping staircases or springed ramps to the higher platforms you want to be on, meaning your interactions with these sections amount to jumping up steps or hitting springs. Skipping everything to try and play it like a regular Sonic game doesn't really work either. Stage gimmicks still get in the way, as does the obsession with square, step-like platforms. Stages are over too quickly this way as well, and you're skipping 90% of the game's stage variants at that point. Skip everything and just play, and the game is unfulfilling. Try and explore to get the good ending, and the strict requirements mixed with a few cheap machine hiding places create a frustrating exercise in hopelessness. You can look it up and or beat your head against the wall until you memorize the game, and then the optimal route becomes so easy to perfect that repeat playthroughs see no meaningful or interesting deviation. Your playthroughs become devoid of what little worthwhile freedom you already had. Special stages are just as frustrating for me, because even in the remake, depth perception kinda sucks, and the later stages have huge problems with UFOs changing directions on a dime. If the target can suddenly start moving in the exact opposite direction mere frames before I reach it, how am I supposed to use my skill to destroy them, without replaying the stage ad infinitum to memorize the UFO paths? Not to mention they're cluttered with traps. Bosses are a decent idea at times, but they're too often designed to troll players. What? Did you expect something different? Collision Chaos has a pinball boss who only needs to be hit once, but the pinball board is extremely small, extremely crowded, and full of bumpers designed very clearly to throw you off of the right path. Oh, not to mention Eggman drops bombs randomly that also act like bumpers, so that's great. Even if you could memorize this and get really good at it, too bad, Eggman can just stop you on a dime for no reason. The boss of Wacky Workbench, meanwhile, punishes you for learning its pattern. The rock you stand on will always launch lower than the others, forcing you to jump to another one to make it to the next level. However, you won't know until it's too late that doing this on the third attempt will lead to you getting crushed by the ceiling, because you're actually supposed to stay on the first rock to hit Eggman. Being underwater while Eggman uses air bubbles as shields is an interesting idea, but nothing worthwhile is done with it. He just zooms back and forth, shooting a few projectiles. Putting him behind a wall on a conveyor belt, forcing you to run so fast that it grinds the ground out from under his feet, is cool, but it literally just amounts to holding right until you hear a bomb being readied, letting it stop above you, and then letting off of the direction and maintaining a slower speed until the bomb lands. That's it for like a minute or so. Sonic CD is a good idea, but Sonic CD is also a mess. I cannot emphasize enough how little playtesting it feels like this game got. Like the development team just assumed their ideas were all great because they sounded great in their heads, and then they got bored before they actually fine-tuned them. Stages genuinely feel like they're broken down into blocks of gimmick, with nothing bringing it all together, and nothing to bring meaning to any of them. I don't think this game is unplayable, but I also don't think it works on almost any level, at least not consistently enough for me to call it anything but poorly thought out. This is far and away my least favorite 2D Sonic title from the 90s, and I think it's easily the most poorly designed Sonic title from this era as well. I have no problem with people loving this game, I wish I did too. And you know, maybe there's a way to remedy that. Maybe there's a game I could play that uses some of Sonic CD's design ideas in a way I'll enjoy much more. But what's your stance on Sonic CD? I know a lot of people are big fans of it, some even argue it's the best Sonic game from this era. If you like it, why do you like it so much? If you enjoyed this video, drop a like, maybe sub, and especially share it with anyone else you think might find it informative or entertainment. See you guys next time.